Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
The genetic diversity of the trees that are on these Christmas tree lots is pretty low. And so genetic diversity is important because it allows these plants to adapt when there's new pests and diseases and droughts and different climates, climate change. We actually took those seeds out of the cold storage and put them in the X-ray machine, and we can see inside the seeds. Many of the seeds were either empty or partially full or were infested with insects.
I'm Sarah Fensky. You may have heard rumors of a Christmas tree shortage this year. Wayne Harmon is the owner of Star Pines Christmas Tree Farm in Boonville, Missouri, and he says that shortage is not necessarily the case.
I would call it a tight supply, and that's because you can find Christmas trees. You'll just have to look a little more if you can't find it at your normal location.
Wayne Harmon says the tight supply is due to more people wanting real Christmas trees this year. Plus, he says, fewer trees were planted 10 years ago. That said, there is a growing problem related to Christmas trees. It has to do with the Fraser fir. Wayne Harmon has farmed firs in Missouri for 36 years. He says the Fraser has become incredibly popular with customers.
It kind of became the Cadillac of Christmas trees here maybe 10, 15 years ago when it came onto the scene in high production numbers, and they were able to ship it, from up north and from the East Coast to here. It grows more in a cooler environment and up at elevation in some of the mountains. And it holds its needles well, and it has a nice soft needle texture, and it's a beautiful tree.
Wayne Harmon has tried to grow the Fraser fir in Missouri. He said the tree has a tough time surviving our summer humidity.
Survival is maybe 1 to 5%, which is not acceptable for production. However, the Canaan, it's almost the exact opposite. That's, you'd have a 95% survivability.
And Harmon is leading a research committee for the Missouri Christmas Tree Association. They plan to test different trees to find something that looks similar to the Fraser fir, but grows well locally. And even so, Wayne Harmon says not to give up on that Fraser fir.
The tell of the tale of the Fraser is not done yet. There's a lot of effort being put into saving the Fraser.
And that is Wayne Harmon, a Christmas tree farmer in Boonville, Missouri. Now, the saving that he's talking about there involves much bigger complications than the Missouri humidity. The real culprit is an invasive sap-sucking insect. The Missouri Botanical Garden says the Fraser is now endangered in the wild due to this insect. Saving it has become a focus in recent years. And joining us now with more on the garden's efforts is Becky Sucher. She is Senior Manager of Living Collections for the Missouri Botanical Garden. Becky, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Becky, tell us a little bit about this sap-sucking insect who's wreaking havoc on Fraser firs. Where does this insect come from?
Well, it actually came from Europe, and it was introduced to the U.S. about 100 years ago. And because the species is not native here, the Fraser fir wasn't able to evolve any type of defense against it. And so a large proportion of our firs were wiped out.
So what kind of damage does this insect cause?
It basically, the tree is not able to transport nutrients anywhere anymore, and so it eventually will just die.
So the insect kind of gets in the way of its normal arteries?
Yeah. Yes.
So the Botanical Garden says 90% of the mature fir trees in Great Smoky Mountains National Park have been killed off in the last 50 years. Is the impact of this insect as big in some of the other growing areas?
Well, that's basically where the tree is from. It's native to the southern Appalachian Mountains, and so that a very large area of its native range was affected. There are a population in West Virginia that actually was able to survive relatively well, and so that's the area that we focused our seed collecting efforts in 2019.
So we see these Fraser firs everywhere. Are they still able to grow in farming conditions then?
Sure. We're able to grow them in farming conditions. Yes, there are pests and diseases that farmers still have to look out for. But we really do want to make sure we conserve those native forests and the genetic diversity that those native forests hold.
I imagine this would have repercussions for those ecosystems if this tree is no longer able to grow in those places.
Yeah, absolutely. It really leads to a completely different ecosystem makeup, which results in other plant and animal species declining and potentially going extinct.
So is the hope that you could replant these trees and get them growing back in this area that they're native to?
Yeah, hopefully that's the goal. I think what we're doing as far with the seed collecting is one small piece of that puzzle. So we are doing what's called ex situ conservation. So that's just one strategy amongst a lot of plant conservation strategies where we bring the species out of its natural habitat. So ex situ versus in situ, which is when you conserve a plant in its native habitat. So seed banking is a type of ex situ conservation where we can collect seed from these trees in the wild and preserve that genetic diversity in our seed banks.
And so you went and gathered, your team, I should say, gathered 17,000 Fraser fir seeds in 2019. Where are those seeds today?
They are in our seed bank. So our seed bank is currently out at Shaw Nature Reserve in Gray Summit, Missouri. We're actually in the process of building a new seed bank here closer to the garden. But yeah, they are in seed storage, which is basically cold in freezers out at Shaw Nature Reserve.
So does freezing potentially have an impact on those seeds?
Yes. So freezing is a good way to preserve genetic materials, preserve seeds for a longer period of time because it basically slows down the metabolic processes in the seeds. But there's a whole process associated to storing those seeds because if you just take a seed out of the wild and throw it in the freezer, there's a lot of moisture content in that seed, and freezing it will create ice crystals that will damage the inside of the seed. So we have to bring that seed back to the seed bank. We have to clean it. We have to dry it down to 15% moisture content before we can put it into the freezers. So that is been determined to be the best moisture content that doesn't cause damage to the seed, but also it leaves enough moisture content so that the seed doesn't die.
So this is some really precise work your team is doing on this.
Yeah. There's a lot more that goes into it than you can imagine, but yes. And this is just one species out of thousands of species that we hope to seed bank.
So of these 17,000 that you have, and you very carefully frozen them, getting the conditions just right, do you have any sense of how many of those would be viable for replanting?
That is a great question. We have a better idea of that now. Previously, we did not. We collected all of those seeds and we dried them down and stored all of them. But excitingly, in the past year or so, we applied for and received a grant to make improvements to our seed bank. And one of those improvements was the addition of an X-ray machine. And so now we actually took those seeds out of the cold storage and put them in the X-ray machine, and we can see inside the seeds. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we found that there was not a great viability, that many of the seeds were either empty or partially full or were infested with insects. And so I guess after that, we then followed up with viability tests, which is the process of germinating a small number of those in the lab. And it was found that they did have low viability. However, we did collect thousands of seeds, and so we still have a decent number of seeds stored in the seed bank, which are potentially viable.
So you mentioned some of these seeds are infested with insects. Is this a different type of insect than has been such a plague in the Great Smoky Mountains?
Yeah, there are all kinds of insects out there, and there's actually several native insects that feed on the Fraser fir. And so, yes, we did find some of these potential insects. We haven't positively ID'd them yet, but we did see they're very, very tiny at that point. But we could see that there was insect damage in those seeds. And that is somewhat natural and to be expected.
Okay, that's no shocking development there.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this X-ray. It seems like you're X-raying something that is so tiny. I assume this isn't just like a normal X-ray that they'd have at a doctor's office.
It actually isn't that different other than, it's not built for seed banks, but it is a self-contained system. So it's a little box that's, about 3 feet by 3 feet. And so you can put the seeds in there in a petri dish, and you close the door so there's no X-rays getting out of the machine. And so you can, and then you can turn it on and you can see the X-rayed images on the screen. It's pretty cool.
So it does sound pretty cool. What a great tool. It must have been just a disappointing moment when you guys realized, hey, a whole bunch of these seeds aren't going to work for us. What was that like there in the lab?
Yeah, it was. Especially because when our staff were there actually collecting the seed, they really thought it was the best possible time. Because another trick about seed collecting is you have to get there at the right time. You have to be there when the seed's ready and it's ripe. And all signs pointed to the seed being ripe. It was coming out of the cones. It was naturally dispersing. And so when we did see those images, it was a little disconcerting. However, any seed banking isn't a one-time effort. We have to go back. We continually go back because even in a freezer, seeds are going to lose viability over time. And so we need to go back and continue to monitor those viability. So we'll take out seeds periodically out of the freezer and test the viability after several years and be able to measure how quickly it's losing viability. And then we can plan additional collections to maintain those those species in the seed bank.
So this is really such a data-driven process. And I understand a big part of your job is recording data on this kind of plant material. What kind of information do you record, and how does that play into the efforts to conserve these Fraser firs?
Yeah, it's interesting because you say there's lots, this isn't the only species like this, but there's a lot of these out there being grown in on Christmas tree lots. So it would seem like they're not necessarily endangered, but we don't really know where those plants came from, and there's no documentation that tells us that. So what's really, really important for botanical gardens when we're bringing plants into the collection is to record as much information as possible. We want wild source plants whenever possible, and then when we're out in the field, we have really high quality GPS units, and we record the latitude and the longitude, but also things like the soil type and the exposure and the sun and this moisture content. What are the other species that are growing around it? This is all really helpful information for any number of purposes, but it helps us get an idea of populations, where they're located, how we might be able to grow it in cultivation, all sorts of things that really allow our collections to have the highest value possible.
And so Christmas trees that are being grown on farms, and there's a great demand for these trees, so there's plenty of farmers happy to grow these things. Those might be genetically different than what you're finding in the true wild. That's part of what's important.
Yeah, and I would guess, and I can't say this for sure, but that the genetic diversity of the trees that are on these Christmas tree lots is pretty low, meaning there is probably very similar. And so genetic diversity is important because it allows these plants to adapt when there's new pests and diseases and droughts and different climates, climate change. And so when you don't have a lot of different genes and different types of kinds of trees that have different traits, a disease could wipe them out very easily. So it's really important to maintain as much genetic diversity within and among populations as possible, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And something else I find myself wondering, we heard from that Christmas tree farmer who explained just how hard it was for them to get the Fraser fir to take off here. Is this somewhat of a difficult project for the botanical garden in that you're also dealing with the Missouri humidity, even though you have, you're putting so much more work into making the conditions just right, but ultimately that's a factor you could come up against.
Right. And I would say growing the plant to long term is not the primary goal. Growing the plant, growing any plant, and a lot of the plants we grow here have never been grown in cultivation before. So we're learning every step of the way, and we record everything we do. We record the soil type. What's the different mix of soil, of different types of soil that we're using, how much moisture, if we're using heat to help the seeds germinate. All of those things are recorded, and we can see our successes and failures along the way because we record that as well. So part of it is just learning how to grow it. We know that this plant is not going to like the heat and humidity of St. Louis, and that's okay. We can still learn a lot by growing it, and we hope to share, and it's not going to thrive here. We can keep it alive to some extent, but it's not going to look like the Christmas tree that's in your living room right now. But we can keep it alive and be able to tell the story to people and use that plant so they can see, and maybe that's a learning, an educational moment in and of itself.
An educational moment. It also sounds like you guys are playing the long game. You're not just trying to get a Christmas tree that'll be ready 10 years' time.
Right.
Well, this has been such interesting work. Becky Sucher, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing about these efforts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
This episode was produced by Kayla Drake with audio engineering by Aaron Dorr and production assistance from Jane Mather-Glass. It was mixed and edited by Jane. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here. If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.